Okay, imagine this. The most talked about AI on the entire planet suddenly goes dark, but just in one country. Well, that's not science fiction. It's exactly what happened in 2023 when Italy became the very first Western nation to pull the plug on ChatGPT. So let's dive into this wild AI showdown.
For a full 28 days, 4 whole weeks. If you were in Italy and tried to use ChatGPT, you got nothing. Silence. This was a major country hitting the off switch on a global phenomenon. It was a huge deal.
So, you have to ask, how on earth did we get here? What could possibly push a national data regulator to take a step that drastic against, well, the biggest name in the AI game? That is exactly what we are going to break down right now.
All right, let's set the scene. Because this whole story, it doesn't actually start with the block itself. It starts with a critical failure that really got the regulators' attention.
And things moved so fast, it was almost whiplash. On March 20th, OpenAI comes out and reports a data breach. Just 11 days later, Italy's data authority, known as the Garante, issues an emergency order to block the service. Done. The clock was officially ticking, and it took OpenAI almost a month of scrambling to get back online.
And this quote right here, from the Garante's official press release, it just cuts right to the heart of it. The regulator wasn't just worried about that one data breach. No, they were questioning the entire foundation of how ChatGPT was built, basically saying there was no legal justification for its massive appetite for our data. So the Garante's case wasn't just some vague feeling they had. It was built on 3 very specific accusations, and each one tied directly to Europe's big data privacy law, the GDPR. First up, let's talk about legal basis. You know, under GDPR, you can't just hoover up people's data because you feel like it. You need a solid, pre-approved reason. That could be getting someone's explicit consent, or maybe it's necessary for a contract. Or there's this thing called legitimate interest, but that's a tricky balancing act.
And that brings us to accusation number 1. The Garante basically said OpenAI had scraped all this personal data from the web to train its models without any valid legal reason. Now, OpenAI came back and claimed legitimate interest, their interest in building this amazing AI. But the regulator just wasn't buying it. And this really set up this fundamental conflict. Does a company's goal of building AI outweigh your fundamental right to privacy?
All right, next up, transparency. This is a huge pillar of the GDPR. It just means companies have to be totally upfront with people about what they're doing with their info. And that goes for both their actual users and, crucially, for non-users whose data they scraped off the internet.
And this is where the Garante landed its second big punch. They said OpenAI failed on a few fronts. First, users weren't clearly told their chats could be used for training. Second, and this is a big one, what about the millions of people who aren't users, but whose blog posts and public comments were scraped? They had no idea. And to top it off, the grantee pointed out that when ChatGPT hallucinates and just makes up false stuff about real people, it's also violating another key principle: data accuracy.
The third accusation really zeroed in on protecting kids. Now, what's super interesting here is that while the GDPR sets a default age of consent at 16, countries can actually lower it. Italy chose 14. But below that age, you absolutely need a parent's permission, no exceptions. And this quote from the regulator really highlights a 2-part failure. First, by not having any age check, OpenAI was illegally processing the data of kids under 14. And second, it was also exposing those same kids to potentially inappropriate or even harmful content. That's a huge safety concern. So, faced with a nationwide ban and a very loud ticking clock, OpenAI really had no choice but to talk to the regulator. And this kicked off a high-stakes, super fast race to meet their demands. This table just lays it all out perfectly. Let's walk through it. The Garante demands a transparent privacy policy. Bam! OpenAI publishes a new one just for Europe. They demand a clear legal basis. Okay, OpenAI officially declared legitimate interest. They demand tools for user rights. OpenAI rolls out new forms for data correction and, this is key, an opt-out form so your chats aren't used for training. And for the age issue, they put up an age gate immediately. With all these changes in place, the Garante was satisfied. Enough to lift the temporary ban. So on April 28th, after 28 long days, ChatGPT was back online in Italy. But the story was definitely not over. See, this whole thing in Italy wasn't just some local spat. It was the first real regulatory challenge to generative AI, and it sent shockwaves across the entire globe. It set a massive precedent.
All of a sudden, data regulators all over Europe who had kind of been watching from the sidelines were jolted into action. It was like the Italian David had just shown everyone that the tech Goliath could actually be challenged.
A huge consequence of this was the creation of a European-level ChatGPT task force. This was a direct response designed to coordinate policy so you wouldn't get a mess of different rules in every country. And at the same time, major players like France, Spain, and Germany all launched their own investigations. The era of easygoing AI regulation in Europe was officially over.
But bringing the service back online wasn't the final chapter. The investigation kept going. And in December of 2024, the Garante dropped the other shoe, a fine. 15 million euros. A clear signal that the initial violations came with a hefty price tag.
Of course, OpenAI had something to say about that. They argued the decision wasn't proportionate and said they would appeal. And get this, they claimed that fine was about 20 times the amount of revenue they'd even made in Italy. So you can see the conflict was far from resolved.
But maybe the most lasting impact is what it did to the product itself. This pressure didn't just change some text in a privacy policy, it forced real engineering changes. Look at this. We went from zero age verification at all to a simple pop-up where you just click a button, all the way to a future with robust third-party ID checks and even AI that tries to predict your age. That is a perfect example of regulation driving privacy by design.
Which leaves us with this one big question. This showdown in Italy, it forced OpenAI to be more transparent, to give users more control, and to build real safeguards for kids. It proved that even the most powerful tech isn't above the law. So, did a single determined regulator manage to teach the world's most famous AI a lesson in responsibility? Well, the answer is still unfolding, but for 28 days in 2023, the whole world was watching and taking notes.